Chapter 11. Ayianna trudged down the vacant street, her dress sloshing against her legs. She entered the inn and stormed up the stairs, wet, cold, and with no other clothes to change into. The burgundy dress didn't count. What a day it had turned out to be! Liam wagged her tail in greeting. Ayianna slouched on the floor and hugged her. She caught sight of the crumpled nightgown on the bed. She straightened, peeled off her wet dress, and draped it on the empty basin. It would take all night to dry. How was she going to explain this to Desmond? Excuses swirled in her head, but none of them seemed plausible. Hooves thundered in the street outside. She donned the nightgown and darted to the window. Men rode by on horseback, carrying the black and gold banner she had seen in Dagmar. She gasped, gripping the windowsill. What were they doing here? Where were Badera's guards? A legion of fur-covered creatures scampered behind them and disappeared into the lengthening shadows. She jumped back from the window. She should run. Where? Find Cale? Why Cale? She shook her head. Maybe she should talk to Cuthbert. She yanked open the door and something crashed in the inn below. She shoved the rising fear down and peered over the thin serpentine railing. Several armed men dragged Cuthbert from the kitchen and shoved him to his knees before a tall man in a large black cloak. Had he been the man watching her from the blacksmith shop? "Get those filthy imps out of my inn!" Cuthbert shouted as he struggled against his attackers. The man in the cloak snorted and leveled his sword. "We're looking for a girl. She'd be new to the area." "Aye, this here's an inn. It's full of newcomers," the old man said. "She's a pretty thing. Long, dark hair, a peasant of sorts. Has a wolf for a pet." Ayianna's chest tightened. The pounding in her ears drowned the innkeeper's response. She forced herself to breathe slowly. How did they find her? Movement beneath the tables caught her eye. Furry creatures scampered about, their noses to the floor like dogs sniffing out a rat. Imps? One of the creatures froze and turned its yellow eyes her direction, its deformed face and body like a human. Dagmar! "This way!" Its scratchy voice called to the others as it charged up the stairs. It speaks? Ayianna slammed the door and locked it. Why were they hunting her? And what was she going to do? She dashed to the window, too high to jump. Liam snarled and Ayianna spun around as claws ripped into the wood. She swallowed a scream and dragged Liam into the adjoining room. The wolf fought her, growling and lunging. Ayianna kicked the door shut and shoved the empty basin against it. She sank to the floor in the darkness. She pulled Liam closer and tried to think. No lights, no weapons, no exit. Trapped. She sucked in her breath and listened. The bed screeched across the floorboards and crashed against a wall. The imps had broken in, and it didn't take them long to discover where she and Liam hid. Claws tore along the walls and the door. Rays of dim light sifted through the shredded wood. The smell of death overwhelmed the small, dark space. Liam broke from her grasp and charged the door. Ayianna backed away and her hand hit something. The iron candle pillar. She stood and grabbed it, knocking the thick, unlit candle to the floor. With both hands she hoisted the heavy pillar in the air. The first imp broke through and Liam tore into it. Another one charged her. Ayianna swung the iron pillar and it collided with the imp's body, knocking it aside. Shrieks erupted in the other room as more imps poured through the broken door, clawing over each other to reach her. She swiped at the oncoming charge. They slammed into the basin and toppled to the floor. More imps leapt upon her. Sharp claws raked across her shoulder. She fell back against the wall and scraped the imp off. The battered door exploded as a man stepped inside and plowed through the imps. Desmond! Relief flooded Ayianna. She swung at the imps with renewed strength. Soon the last imp crumpled to the ground. She leapt into the man's arms, tears streaming down her face. "Not mad at me anymore?" he asked, pulling away. Ayianna looked not into Desmond's blue eyes, but Cale's grey. "You!" she recoiled. "Who'd you expect? Desmond's obviously got more important things to do." "You are unbelievable!" She pushed her way past him and tripped over the imp strewn about the floor. She collapsed on the bed and clenched her hands together, but they wouldn't stop shaking. He wiped the blood from his sword on the fur of an imp and sheathed it. Kicking a few of the dead imps out of his way, he strode out of the room. "Fine, just leave me here for the next batch of filthy, smelly creatures." She eyed one and immediately wished she hadn't. The almost human face glared at her from an odd angle. Blood oozed from its nose and mouth. She gagged and quickly looked away. Cale reappeared in the doorway. "Come on!" "But what about Desmond?" "Don't be foolish. The city is crawling with imps, and I bet your dearly beloved wouldn't even stand a chance if he were here." "I never said he was my dearly beloved." "Aren't you betrothed to him?" Cale crossed the room and peered out through the windows. She clung to Liam. "Not by choice." He returned to the doorway and faced her. "If we don't leave now, we'll be trapped." Ayianna glanced at the scattered imp carcasses, hoping Desmond would walk through the doorway any moment. Liam pulled away, sniffed, and pawed at them. Then the wolf sauntered over to Cale and sat on her haunches. "Traitor! Any minute now, Desmond would rush in." Seconds slid by, but he didn't appear. "We can't wait for him," Cale said, and patted Liam on the head. The wolf looked at her master and tilted her head. Ayianna scowled at her. "Where are we going?" she asked. "We will meet Saeed at the stables." "But," Ayianna glanced at her wet clothes hanging on the windowsill, "I'm wearing a nightgown." "You have no choice." He jerked a robe from the chest against the wall and threw it to her. "You can't be serious." His eyes narrowed. "Do I look like I'm jesting?" The rest of her protest withered. She tugged the robe on and followed Cale from the room. Hopefully Desmond would find them soon. The inn was empty except for the few dead bodies laying beneath the remnants of tables and chairs. No sign of Cuthbert, though. Ayianna cringed as the stairs creaked beneath her feet. Cale didn't seem to notice as he and Liam were already waiting for her at the entrance. He didn't wait long. As soon as Ayianna drew near, he pressed through the swinging door. She pulled the robe tighter and ducked outside after him. Darting from shadow to shadow, they made their way to the stables. The feast of Jeju was winding down. The people lingered, filling their bellies with food and ale, unaware of the calamity that had crept into the city. Hanging lanterns lined the cobbled street and burned dim as the sun dipped behind the trees. Hanging lanterns lined the cobbled street and burned dim as the sun dipped behind the trees, casting the cramped buildings in a crimson glow. Ayianna watched the people laugh and eat. "Maybe we should warn someone." "Darren is taking care of that," Cale said. He slinked toward the stables. His silent, graceful movements reminded her he was an elf. "Citizens of Badara!" A man in a green and gold uniform stood on a platform for all to see. He held up a gold goblet. "A toast!" The people roared in agreement as they raised their own worn mugs and held them high. "You who have waited, longed for this day!" Ayianna took a step back toward the courtyard and peered around a slouching man's shoulders. The crowd drained their mugs in unison. "Lord Winston," Cale's hand gripped her elbow. "He should be concerned for the safety of Badara and its king." Ayianna glanced around at the large stone towers looming above them, empty and dark. Where were the guards? Cale tugged and she pulled her attention away from the captain and followed. To the right, a low building stretched along the curtain wall next to a large corral. The earthy smells of hay and manure drifted on the breeze. They sprang from the shadows and hurried inside the stables. The thud of hooves echoed off the buildings and wheels ground across the cobblestones outside. Ayianna peered through the wooden boards as several dark-clad men on horseback galloped past. A procession of imps shuffled before a carriage constructed from what seemed to be a mass of black bones. Liam growled. Ayianna placed her hand on the wolf's back. At the edge of the courtyard, the bone carriage rumbled to a stop, and a man stepped out. A murmur rose through the crowd. The tall stranger joined Lord Winston at the top of the dancer's stage. Black hair and a goatee trimmed his handsome face. He smiled and held his hand over the crowd as if greeting his subjects. His charm drew her in, yet repulsed her. "My Lord Dirk, it is ready," Lord Winston said, offering the gold goblet to him. "Thank you, friend." Lord Dirk accepted the goblet. He flung his black coat back and held his hand high. "People of Badara, may I present to you the Book of Tharin." Several noblemen approached, hoisting a leather-bound tome on a platform. "Nijal!" Dirk exclaimed. Bright orange flames erupted from his outstretched hand and consumed the book. Ayianna gasped. The crowd watched it burn. An unnatural silence gripped them as if no one dared move or breathe. "May the ancient laws of the sacred pearl disintegrate just as the book in which they are written burns. Today We forge our own destiny in freedom, a new liberty for the Prathay Plains. The crowd stared on as the man drank from the goblet. A soft chant rose from behind him. Was it the dancers? Jizuri Rusha Thikosa Shoza Kuta Luluthata Nuletu Oko Kwa Lole Tu Thol Lul Goleth Lusaruletu Thutath Telu Ath Ele Lu Kwathi Thene Thile Mata Mata Lul Thutath Quali Thatu Tuiso Thile. What's going on? Whispered Ayianna. They are hailing that man as the new king. But what about King Valdemar? Where is he? Darren will find him. We'd better get these horses saddled. Kale withdrew to the shadows. Badera closes its gate at sundown. We don't have much time. Saeed will be here soon. Kale grabbed a couple of bridles and a saddle from the tack room. Ayianna located the stall where their horses had been bedded down. They pawed the straw and threw their heads, their eyes wide, their nostrils flared. Could they sense the tension in the air, or was it something else? Easy there, she whispered and unlatched the gate. The horses burst through, knocking her against the wall. What are you doing? Kel grabbed a rope off the wall. You'll lose our mounts! Ayianna gritted her teeth. She scrambled to her feet and yanked another saddle off the large wooden barrel protruding from the tack room. She lugged it toward Kale, who had secured the sorrel. She plopped the saddle on the ground. He finished saddling the one and went after the roan. Liam paced the aisle. The stable opened into a corral to the right. Behind them, stalls lined the wall and contained several horses. They shifted, restless. Something was wrong. With teeth bared, Liam slunk past Kale as he placed the bridle on the roan. The wolf headed for the corral, growling. What was she sensing? The horse jerked away from Kale, snorting and pawing the ground. Easy there, Kale said as he lunged to catch the horse's reins. Imps dropped from the rafters. The stable exploded in chaos. Horses bucked and kicked, racing around the corral. Ayianna stumbled backward. Why were the imps after her? One of the horses reared, breaking away from Kale. The other one bolted. Kale dodged the terrified horses, leapt over the imps, and unsheathed his sword. He swung, the blade hissing through the air as it crunched into bone. Ayianna tripped over a saddle and fell. Bile burned her throat. Was this how she would die? The roan reared up, striking the air with its hooves where she'd been standing. An imp tore at the horse's neck. Ayianna spun out of the way just as the horse's hooves came crashing down. She sprang from the ground, but tripped on the hem of her robe. How clumsy could she be? She jerked her robe free and ran toward the gate. An imp landed on her shoulders, knocking her to the ground again. Its claws ripped into her face. The wound burned, and warm blood trickled down her cheek. She shoved the imp away and scrambled to her feet. The imp tumbled into the straw. It spun around and snarled. Spotting a pitchfork against the wall, Ayianna grabbed it and waved it in front of her. Kill it! She couldn't. Its yellow eyes held an intelligence that neither bird nor beast had, albeit a twisted one. And it could talk. She plunged the fork at him, but her attempt was weak, and he batted the tines away. "You can't kill me." The imp pranced around and made crude gestures with its clawed hands. "You can't." Kale's blade sliced through the imp's neck and its head toppled to the ground. He swung around and caught the last imp through the gut. He wiped his blade on its furry carcass. "Weak. You stall like that again and you're dead." Tears stung her eyes, and her hands and legs trembled. She wanted to throw accusations back at him, but her jaw refused to unclench. Hooves pounded into the stable. Ayianna stumbled over the straw mound, away from the new assailant. She glanced over her shoulder. Kale stood, brandishing his sword. A hooded figure stooped in his saddle and reined in his mount. "Kale, now!" "Saeed!" Relief flooded her. Kale sheathed his sword. He cornered the skittish roan and leapt atop. Ayianna scanned the stables. Where had the sorrel gone? Her heart plummeted. They wouldn't leave her behind, would they? Kale wheeled his horse around and barreled toward her. He leaned over, his hand outstretched. "No, wait!" He jerked her up into the saddle behind him and urged the horse to gallop. Several more imps dropped from the ceiling. Kale yanked the horse left. Ayianna lost her grip and toppled off. She slammed against a stall and slid to the floor. Her right side burned. "Get up!" Kale yelled at her. She scrambled to her feet. He grabbed her and hauled her back on the mount a second time. He kicked the horse's flank. They raced through the stables into the corral. They were trapped, but Kale urged the horse faster. "What are you doing?" "Hold on!" They sped toward the wooden fence. She grasped him around the waist and leaned to his back. The horse lurched. It leapt, but pitched forward as its hind hooves caught the railing. Despite her fear, their mount landed firmly on the other side. They raced through the narrow streets. The roan hooves clattered against the cobblestones and echoed off the buildings. The shrill sound of metal grinding against metal jolted Ayianna. She peered around Cale's shoulder. Ahead, Saeed galloped through the gatehouse. The portcullis fell. Ayianna snapped the reins and the horse lunged forward. Ayianna buried her face into Cale's back, squeezing him tighter. The giant iron grid slammed shut behind them.